Hello, this is Teresa sharing my first video with Dare2BArtzy. I'll be showing you how I created this floral card using the Shine stamp set and coordinating dies. I will start off by using the 3 large floral stamps. I'll place them in the Misti positioning tool, and then I will ink them up with a no-line ink, in this case ink on 3, and I will stamp this 3 times to make sure that it is dark enough for me to see, but not so dark that I see the lines. Later I will be embossing over this image, so I will leave the stamps exactly where they are for later. So now I'm moving on to the Copic coloring. Since I'm using Copics today, I stamped my images on Express It blending card. However, you could also use Neenah Solar White cardstock instead of this particular paper. I'm going to start with the lightest color towards the bottom of the flower, and then I will be going progressively in the lightest yellow to the darkest yellow that I'm choosing today, and I'm putting the Copic numbers up on the screen as I'm using them. So my approach to this is just to draw an outline around each petal that's roughly in kind of a diamond or even triangular shape. And then once I draw that little outline, I'm filling in the center of it. Now, like I said, I'm not really worried so much about blending today because I'm going to be embossing over the top of this image, and even if I did a lot of blending, a lot of that would be obscured because of all the details that are in the stamped image. I'm going to use the same color palette for all of the flowers, so in the center of this one, I'm using E50 again before moving on to Y13 and Y15, and I don't use the darkest marker on the second flower. Since a lot of this really will be pretty repetitive, I will put on some music and you can just observe the coloring. If you decide you want to skip past that part, you can go ahead and skip ahead and see how this comes together after the coloring is done. And now that the coloring is done, I'll treat the paper with an anti-static powder tool, add it back to the Misti, and because my stamps are in the exact same place as they were when I stamped before, it will be really easy to add some clear embossing ink on top of them. In this case, I'm using VersaMark, and I stamped twice just to be sure that I got all the details from the stamp. I am adding gold embossing powder on top, and after tapping off the excess, I will heat set that. As you'll notice, after I heat set, the large sunflower shaped image actually could not get as much embossing powder shaken off as I needed to, so I ended up coloring and stamping it again off screen. So when you see the final card put together, even though I did go ahead and emboss it here, I did not actually use this image because I did not apparently get it good enough with the anti-static tool. And now I'm using the coordinating dies from this stamp set to cut out the floral images, and then I'll put them aside until I'm ready to use them for the final card construction. I have a piece of cream cardstock here, and I'm stamping a pattern using a light brown ink. So I'm just alternating the bee and the small flower that's in the set, and then just repeat the process for each line underneath, just making sure they alternate each time until I have filled this panel with that pattern. And to add some interest to this panel, I'm going to be partially tearing off pieces on it. I'm mainly tearing from the bottom and the top of this. I don't really want to tear from the sides because I did want to leave that section somewhat straight. And I'll go ahead and distress it with this tool in order to make it not look so, so nice and neat on those edges. And then I'll use this Inkpad. It's the same one I just used earlier to stamp the pattern on here. And I'm just going around and adding some ink to the edges of this to give it some more definition and make it pop more against the craft cardstock that I'm using for the base. And I want to be sure that I have enough room for the sentiment, so I needed to go back and tear a little bit more off and then re-ink the edge again like I had done before. And now I'm ready to stamp the sentiment onto the craft cardstock. So I'm putting this back in the Misti, and I'm temporarily putting the torn panel, I have not glued it down yet, in order to make sure I get the placement where I want it to be. So again, I'm using VersaMark ink to stamp down the first part of the sentiment. Then I'm going to take the second word, wishes, because I wanted it to be pretty close together, and therefore I couldn't really stamp it at the same time as the larger word. So again, I'll add VersaMark ink to that, stamp it down, and I'm going to add the same gold detail embossing powder that I did when I was doing the floral images earlier, and heat emboss that. And since I use gold embossing powder on a regular basis, I store mine in a large plastic container to make it more convenient to use on my projects. And I just love the way the gold embossing powder looks against craft paper. And I'll wipe off that excess powder, and I'm going to glue down this panel that I created earlier just flat against my card base, which is an A2 size top folding size, which is a finished size of 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. So now that that's in place, I'm going to add my embellishment, which is some natural raffia. I'm using a reverse tweezers in order to hold that together so that I can glue that down. And sometimes the easiest way to do something that's a little bit messy like this is to use a little bit of hot glue. I am using a low temperature glue gun, by the way, because this is paper and high heat can just be too much for this type of thing. I have this piece of silicone that actually fits over your finger so that you don't get your fingers burned in the process of using hot glue this way. So I'm going to stamp on the inside of the card just to continue the design on the inside using 2 of the floral images and the shine sentiment as well. I'm going to use the same brown ink to stamp this. One thing I did realize later after creating this card is that the ink was a lot lighter than I expected once it dried. So if I were to do it again, I probably would have embossed this instead of stamping it down with this ink, or used a darker color, or stamped it a couple more times. I mean, as it is right now, you can see it pretty clearly. It's just that it did fade a little bit later on. So now I'm ready to add the flowers to the card and complete this design. Just using some liquid adhesive, I'm just putting it towards the bottom of the die cuts, and then I'll start placing them in there behind the raffia that I've already put in there. And now adding a generous amount of glue to the final flower before I put a block on top of it and allow that to dry for a bit. And as a final step, I'm trimming off a little bit of that raffia around the edges so it's not sticking out way too much. And as a final embellishment touch, I'm adding some gold Nuvo drops. And that will complete the card for today. I'm so excited that you spent some of your precious time with me today watching this video. I hope that you will subscribe to the channel and give me a thumbs up if you liked the video. Thank you very much for watching. Now I dare you to be artsy.